Hello, hello, and welcome to Legal Bites. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I am a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and I apologize for the dog barking. Anyway, on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. And I'm so excited to have my two guests here today. We are going to get into some very interesting topics. It's a little bit different than what we have been doing lately on this channel. Mostly we're talking about what the law is. Then the other day, we talked a little bit about what the law could be or should be with Andrew Branca and with Darth Crypto, talking about Kyle's Law, Kyle's Pledge. And so today we're getting a little bit more hypothetical, theoretical, philosophical, talking about what we can sort of surmise from video games about laws and society and human nature and all that kind of fun stuff. So if you're enjoying this as you're watching, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and otherwise share the video, etc., all the good YouTube stuff. If you are really enjoying it, you can always support us on Locals, Patreon, or through YouTube memberships or through merch. All of that kind of stuff is in the description below, because if you are at all familiar with this channel, you know that we don't really shy away from controversial topics. So we typically get demonetized with most of our live streams. So with that, one last detail, super chats. Thank you in advance for any super chats that anybody wants to give. I will probably go over most of those towards the end, unless there's something that is an interesting point of a question or a comment to sort of add to the discussion. But otherwise, I want to be very mindful of my guests' time and attention and whatnot. So with that, I will bring in my two guests. So,
hey.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here, guys.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, Rick, people that have been here for a while have probably seen you once or twice on the channel, but just in case anyone is new here, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes. Well, my name is Rick Hoeg. I am a lawyer. What did you say? Barred in Michigan. So I'm licensed to practice in Michigan, but I'm talking about in the YouTube space, video games, business and law through the lens of pop culture, primarily technology and video games. Quite a lot about Twitter this week, quite a lot about Activision Blizzard, basically every week. And we love to have those conversations. And so I'm looking forward to having one here with you.
All right.
Oh, I also have some kind of affiliation with Colin. He could probably cover that. I don't know.
and Colin, I figure probably a lot of the people watching are going to be coming from your channel that are big fans of yours. But in case there's someone like my mom who might not be as familiar with you,
hi, Mom.
why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. First of all, Rick, hair is looking great. I never see you not wearing a hat.
You know, I get a lot of comments that say, "Oh, he must be going bald or something."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Well,
you got to flex on him, then.
Folks.
Stunt on him a little bit."
Yeah.
My name is Colin Moriarty. I've been in the video games industry for almost 20 years, and I own a company called Last Stand Media. We are the biggest fan-funded video game podcast network in the world. We do a PlayStation podcast, an Xbox podcast, and a retro and nostalgia podcast. And Rick is actually our quote-unquote legal analyst. He was the very first person that we started bringing on our show as a guest that we started paying for his expertise. We like to try to really treat all of our creators well. We have what I call a little micro community. And so we have a lot of fun over there. And I went and got a bachelor's degree from a school that had a law school. So that's my expertise.
That's your connection. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
Awesome.
No, just to gild Colin's lily a little bit. He actually was the one that volunteered to put me in the paid contributor category. He has been nothing but great at Last Stand Media, and I have to say that because he won't say it for himself. So it's been a great relationship, and yeah, I mean, I'm on there once or twice a month at this point.
Yeah,
so it's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's awesome. So and for anybody watching, if you guys aren't already familiar with their channels, there are links in the description below to both of them, so you can definitely go and check them out for sure. It's super interesting content. And I think it's especially appropriate that this subject matter for this live stream is talking, I think, mostly about, or using mostly The Last of Us as sort of a jumping off point to talk about a lot of this stuff. Because Rick, I first came across your channel with your postmortem on The Last of Us Part 2.
Oh, really? You came through a postmortem?
Yeah, I did.
That's funny. Yeah, my Last of Us Part 2 postmortem, I think, is my most popular of the non kind of legal videos that I have up there in virtual legality. So that's interesting. I actually didn't know that about you. But I said a lot. For folks that don't know me, I'm very interested in narrative. I believe very strongly in the power of stories to inform the human experience and emotions. And I can go sound like a lit major or whatever, but I really do mean it. I think stories are very powerful. So suffice to say, Last of Us Part 2, I thought had some narrative issues that didn't line up with character motivations and things like that. We could talk about that as much or as little as you want, Legal Bites.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wound up doing an hour-long video talking about pacing and structure and a lot of what I think we're going to be talking about today, which is the nature of vengeance and how good stories can be told with that and how bad stories can be told with that as its baseline.
Absolutely. And Colin, actually, so my husband, Mr. Bites, he's been a fan of yours for, he says he can't really remember exactly, but he said it's been at least 8 years.
Yeah,
and
probably.
he pointed me to your spoiler cast when you were working for IGN talking about The Last of Us, doing sort of a postmortem on that.
Yeah.
As
we had
one
Neil
of his,
on that, right? Neil was on that, right? That postmortem, I think we had the creator of the game on.
Druckmann?
Yeah.
No, he wasn't on that. He wasn't on that one. But it was like you and Greg and a couple other guys.
Yeah, whoever it was, Andrew Goldfarb, probably Ryan Clements, maybe. Yeah, something like that, depending on the timing. Yeah.
So, but he pointed me to that, and it was very interesting to sort of go through his sort of history of how we're sort of following you guys both. So it's so exciting to have you guys here.
Cool. I appreciate the kind words. And by the way, I said it to you over email, but congratulations to you guys for the amazing work you were doing in a very contentious environment as we continue to wrest control of commentary from the big people. And I know that you and a lot of people in your sphere have been doing great work. So congratulations right back to you. I just play video games.
Yeah. Thank you.
No,
well, I mean, but it's the commentary, whether it's legal or social or whatever, it all can be very powerful, and it all can bring a lot of meaning to a lot of people. So I think the work that you do is also very, very meaningful as well. And I think that also should be applauded.
Yes, I agree. And by the way, I love that you chose The Last of Us just because, to talk about or to kind of frame things around, because my audience knows that I have a great affinity for The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. And
yeah, I mean, this is one of our disconnects, I think. I recall having this conversation, Colin. So I think this will be good.
I think so too. I should note, by the way, that I like to put my conflicts of interest out there. Neil Druckmann is a personal friend of mine, who's the creative director of the game. And I know people that have worked on the game, but I don't think I let that affect my feelings on it. I'm just totally into it. But I do want to put that out there so the audience can make their own determination.
Sure.
Totally fine.
That makes perfect sense, especially since I know I have some new viewers coming from a video collaboration that I just did with Carl Jobs talking about conflicts of interest. Well, those are all financial conflicts of interest, but giving reviews on certain products and stuff like that. Sure. So very, very timely, I guess we could say.
Good.
So I guess we could kind of, let me give a little bit of a soliloquy, I guess, if you will, about sort of my thinking on setting this whole conversation up, because it does kind of have to do with Kyle Rittenhouse a little bit and kind of not at the same time. So I guess for context, there's been a lot of discussion on the Kyle Rittenhouse trial that just took place. And, I don't want to go into the details of the trial, but I think it sort of serves as a window for us to be able to talk about some of the themes of human nature. And I think that there's some really interesting overlap in people's reactions to this particular trial and to certain games, The Last of Us in particular, because there are, you guys are obviously examples that you can either love the game or hate the game. Usually people are not anywhere in between. I guess specifically The Last of Us Part 2. I think most people
it was very contentious.
tend to like the first one.
Yeah.
And so I think that, but one of the things that I think many people can probably agree on here is that it's given us a lot of points where we can talk about human nature, the rules that bind society, and the ways that people can come up with new rules to sort of guide human behavior. Because at the end of the day, that's really all law is. It's just a series of rules that guide behavior through a series of incentives or disincentives, and sometimes even punishments. So even where there's not really a strong judicial system, sometimes through culture, you can also have some semblance of a pseudo judicial system, because people will come up with certain rules for behavior. And you can see that in The Last of Us Part 2 with the societies, the sort of, or these tribes almost, that sort of set themselves up with the scars and the wolves and the fireflies. After Fedra goes the way of extinction. So I guess we can probably kind of start with some more general questions about The Last of Us. I know you guys kind of already hinted at it, but sort of we can sort of start with your overall thoughts or impressions on The Last of Us or The Last of Us Part 2. I know that your fans obviously know how you feel, but again, if there's anybody new here that isn't familiar with your thoughts on it.
Sure. So sorry, I write notes, by the way, when I'm on podcasts, so that's why I was like scrambling around for my pen. I couldn't find it. So I consider The Last of Us at the time in 2013 when it came out to be arguably the greatest game of all time. If you can remove the barriers that, especially nostalgic barriers, that would give benefit to other games on my list, a la Super Mario World, a la Mega Man 3, which is technically my favorite game ever, although I wouldn't say that's the best game of all time. When you can segment these things, I remember encountering The Last of Us Part 1 in a review environment. I was still working at IGN at the time, and it was the only 10 I ever gave a game. I reviewed hundreds of games, and it was the only 10 I ever gave out. And I always say that I would go back and probably redo most of my reviews and give out new scores to almost every game that I reviewed. And that's just the reality of the situation, with years having passed, sometimes 15 years having passed. But this is the one that I would totally stand by. And I think that The Last of Us Part 2, you could argue, is even better. And I was shocked by how contentious the game was. And I feel like part of its contentiousness, although I think Hoeg can talk to this more, because I'm sure he has issues outside of it, but I think a lot of the contentiousness, we can no doubt say, began because much of the game purportedly leaked and people started putting their own spin on what they thought happened based on file names and out of context cutscenes and all of the rest. I think if anything, you could say The Last of Us Part 2 is maybe 5 hours too long. But yeah, I think it's absolutely wonderful. And the mysteries in between the folds of The Last of Us, especially with what you're talking about with order, judicial systems, vigilantism, and all those kinds of things, exist in the folds in a major way. Obviously, the second one is about vigilantism, but there is a 20-year period between the end of the world and the first game, and we have no idea what happened there. We still have no idea in the lore what actually went on with Fedra, how power vacuums were filled, how justice came to be, how things disintegrated. So The Last of Us sets up this really wonderful world. And I didn't think it needed to be revisited, but when they opted to revisit it with a sequel, I feel like they now need to do a third one. And I think they will do a third one to kind of cap it all off and make it full circle. I don't know who you'll play as. I think that might drive people insane in and of itself. Maybe even we get a prequel, which would be cool. I would love a prequel. But and we can get Joel and people can stop crying about golf clubs and stuff like that.
Objection.
Yeah. So Rick, I'll throw it to you, but those are my feelings on the game. I feel like it's an incredibly impressive feat. And I was saying on the show, Rick, recently, and I don't know if you feel the same way, that I think The Last of Us, the original one, is somewhat surprising because it wasn't necessarily made by their A team. Everyone kind of folded in to do the game later, but Uncharted 3 was technically their A game. So at that time. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that I really love those games.
I think that's great. No, absolutely. And Legal Bites, I think you're going to get me fired off of Last Stand Media for Last of Us Part 2 thoughts. No, I'm kidding around. First of all, I think I don't know that I have a lot to add with respect to Part 1. I also have it as basically in my top 10. I think it's a fantastic feat of exactly what I was talking about is important to me, which is narrative and storytelling and character motivation. And the folks that made Last of Us Part 1, and I know there's a lot of overlap, but at that time, what they were aimed at, what they accomplished with that was pretty phenomenal, especially for kind of the AAA action adventure space in video games, which often looks at the question and says, okay, we got to have 4-quadrant appeal. Nathan Drake has to be wisecracking. We have to have some adventures and things like that. And for the most part, there's adventure, there's exploration. It's a road trip kind of game. The Part 1 is very much focused on not being Marvel Cinematic Universe quippy. It has moments, it has giraffes, it has these kinds of things, but it's more invested in growing a character relationship, a father-daughter type character relationship, and really all building to the finale and what that means. Now, I do have a certain amount of issue with the fact that you're playing a linear game and you don't get the choice at the end. There's nothing that you can do to advance the ball at the end. So they're telling the story they want to tell, and that involves Joel going crazy in a hospital. But even then, I like linear games. I like JRPGs because I want the developer to be able to tell the story they want to tell. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have criticisms, as I do in part 2, but at the end of part 1, when you get that moment where, you know, you're talking about lying and who knows who's lying, et cetera, I thought that was just the absolutely perfect beat to end such a kind of amorphous, ambiguous world on. And I admit, in terms of tilt, I was pretty much against a part 2 project from the get-go, in terms of I don't see how this is going to benefit the world situation. I think you have basically a perfect masterpiece, and I didn't think it was something that made sense. Now, I will grant Colin, and I think this happens in politics and social groupings in every instance, that there are folks that hate The Last of Us Part 2 for reasons that I find to be untenable. And some of that is, hey, it got leaked. Some of that is, heck, I did a series of videos on the fact that Sony was, let's be nice, aggressively using the DMCA when those leaks happened. And I might have named that series as Sony violating the law. I can't, you know, who can remember these things? But I did about 14 or 15 videos on this is not what the DMCA does. You can't actually strike a tweet under the DMCA for using the word golf club. Okay, like this isn't, they were way beyond what they should have been doing at that point in time. But I deliberately didn't follow the leaks. I was interested in what this was going to be. I didn't look at any of those things. It's possible that I got, you know, memed things like golf clubs that I didn't understand because I didn't have the context. So I went in pretty blank to The Last of Us Part 2. And yes, I think there are people that are upset that Joel gets what he gets. Is this a spoiler cast? We don't have to.
Oh yeah. I should probably
this,
just say anybody watching beyond this point, there's going to be plenty of spoilers because we're going to talk about both
I don't know how we can
Last of Us Part 2.
But I wanted to before. So yeah. I think there are a lot of people that you can see online that are like, Joel was my guy, and how could they do that? And I get that. And I don't find that to be where I'm upset about this story. Where I get upset, and I think I was nodding my head pretty vociferously, is I think it has massive structural and pacing issues in terms of doubling up the game and doing things that are completely tangential to what the first half of the game is, doing it again. And then on top of that, I have pretty massive character motivation issues where, you know, when you're watching a movie, when you're watching a TV show, and you get to that point where you're like, well, I can feel that the writers need this to happen, so they're going to pull their strings. I remember this pretty vividly watching the program Lost, right? Where you have to have people that know things not say it to each other, where you have to move people into the jungle in a specific way. I felt that very, very significantly in The Last of Us Part 2, that they wanted to do this, and this, and hell or high water, they're going to move these people into position. And by the way, they're going to make you spend another 2 hours going to the next weenie off in the distance. And that didn't work for me. Now, I will also say, as part of that postmortem, this was, in my opinion, when it was released, one of the prettiest, most well-realized worlds that I had ever seen. I think the gameplay is pretty much normal. I don't see a lot that's special there. But in terms of the graphics, I thought it was absolutely amazing. So at that point in time, you've got amazing graphics. You got good vocal performances. And I think, what did I name my video? It can be for nothing. All in the service of a story that I didn't think was valuable. And that, more importantly, I thought basically treated its audience as if this was the first vengeance story they'd ever seen, and its characters in the same way. So Last of Us Part 1, I think, is absolutely genius work. I think it's fantastic. It belongs in the Hall of Fame of video games. Last of Us Part 2, I feel very differently about. That's the long story short. I think my postmortem's an hour and 20 minutes. So you can check that out if you're interested. But that's where I come down on Part 2.
It's funny you say that, by the way, because it was the only time on Sacred Symbols that we did 2 spoiler casts for the same game, because people were so mad at the first spoiler cast that we did a second one. Like,
which one was positive and which one was negative?
They were, neither of them were
okay.
Well, neither of them were different. It was just like, you didn't talk about this, and you didn't talk about this, and you didn't talk about this. And so we ended up doing like 5 hours on this game and just can't placate anyone.
People are very passionate about it. If you're in the business of selling entertainment products, I don't think that's at all a bad thing. I mean, right. I think you'd prefer everybody to praise it and have 10s across the board, but they mostly got that from kind of the critic side of things. Mm-hmm. And then people are still, if I say The Last of Us Part 2 on Twitter right now, I'm going to get 100 comments, either telling me I'm an asshole or otherwise.
Yeah, or show this the golf club or
I mean, it's still of mine. It is The Last Jedi of video games and pretty close in time. So you get these very strong feelings. And unfortunately, as I was saying, I do think you get caught up in a group, right? Like there's certain things that people assume about me because I very much dislike The Last of Us Part 2 that are completely inaccurate, but you're always kind of taking on the extreme sides of whatever group you're in. Because there's things you could say about people that love Last of Us Part 2 that might not be accurate and probably isn't about any given person. It's one of the things I really hate about kind of combining groupthink into these things. It's like, well, all right, you want to say all of these isms or phobias about me. It's like, if you look at my postmortem, I don't care about any of that. In fact, I think a lot of the stuff that they do there is good, but I just didn't like the story they chose to tell or how they chose to tell it.
I was a little bit more recently acquainted with the franchise because I guess a little bit of background on my I guess gaming history. I grew up with older brothers who we had a Nintendo 64. So we played GoldenEye, we played Mario Kart and all that kind of stuff, but I mostly played when they were playing. So after they grew up, went off to college, and then eventually I went off to college, I sort of have this like gap of time where I wasn't really around gaming very much because I didn't really seek it out on my own. But then I met my now husband, and he's very much into gaming. He has all kinds of video games that he has both finished and not finished and not started. And and he he watches all kinds of YouTube channels about video gaming and gaming news and all that kind of, like, he is fully in it, and so he was the one that really sort of introduced me. Like he bought me my Switch when I turned 30. So that's my first console that I actually own on my own. And so when The Last of Us Part 2 was going to be coming out, he was like, hey, listen, this game is really important to me and I need you to experience it with me. And so that you can understand what this game is all about, because this sequel is coming up. I know it's going to be very important to me as well. So let's experience it together and tell me what you think. And I fell in love with it. It was great. So in the same way that the Girlfriend Reviews talks about being like a backseat gamer, that's sort of how I see most of my experience with gaming. Although we have started to play other games together since then.
Had you played Part 1 before 2 then, or did you just jump in at 2?
No, so we started with Part 1, and then he made sure to keep the authenticity of the experience.
The experience would be like just popping into 2. It might work. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be pretty jarring, I think.
Yeah.
It would just be very, very confusing, I think. So I was fully primed and ready when Part 2 came out, and we were all excited that weekend to just really dive into it. And I really enjoyed it. People that comment on my video on it, talking about whether or not Joel was justified, I think maybe have an impression that I didn't like Part 2 and that I was sort of like sticking it to Neil Druckmann, like, yeah, he was justified actually for the most part, but I actually really enjoyed it. And I think a lot of that really had to do with sort of the experimentation of using video games as an experiential sort of, no, that's not the right word, but more of an experience than sitting passively and watching a movie, right? Like it's very similar to a book or a movie, but you are actively engaged in it. And so it really sort of explored the extent to which the player can really get involved and actively participate and really feel the feelings of these characters. Like when you wake up and you realize, oh no, I'm Abby. I don't want to be Abby because I was just taking so much joy out of getting revenge after Joel died and killing all of these people. It was just a total thrill ride. And now all of a sudden I have to grapple with the fact that I am her and I have to see the world through her eyes. It was, for me, I thought that was a very powerful tool personally, because it really helps with sort of seeing violence in with a sense of empathy, I guess. I don't know what you guys think.
I think that's really interesting, because I think this might be where one of my big kind of disconnects with the folks that love it actually lives, which is and I know you're a lawyer here, so this is not disparaging. I often characterize myself on my channel and elsewhere as a rule of law guy. That society structures are in fact improved by having some kind of rule set, even if you disagree, that is neutrally and naturally applied to everyone. So the premise of this game, and I grew up in the 80s, right? So I've watched tons of revenge movies. I enjoy them for what they are. But there was always a notion that functionally this course of action is wrong-ish, or it's at least extrajudicial. It's outside the bounds of what society generally accepts. And so the impetus behind this game, when Ellie starts, and she actually has a line in this game that I think I complained about in my postmortem about how the fact that she and Joel like to watch 80s action movies, where I'm in my head going, well, they're about how vengeance is destructive and burns the soul and all this stuff. And she should know that when she gets her impetus to go out on her quest, that nobody kind of voices this concern at that point in time, a fairly simple moral kind of, hey, maybe we shouldn't just go murder people. And we can talk about society changing and those kinds of things, and I think we will. But that's where I have the disconnect as a person, right? You said, hey, it was a thrill ride. We're getting vengeance. We're killing all these people. I'm against Ellie from moment one. This is a mistake. This is a silly thing that you're doing. And then when you double up on that, when you double the time frame of your game to tell me the same thing another 15 times, when that's where my brain is at, I get frustrated. I know the other side are human beings, Neil. I know that. You can talk to me about it. We can free Zebra, whatever else we're doing. That's fine. But I already knew that. So I think that's where the disconnect comes from most strongly, is that I'm already thinking, okay, this is going to be a tale of how much pain this brings, etc. When that's a note that I already have. And that might be me. That might be, folks that like those stories and tales of adventure in 80s movies and whatnot from before. But that might be where a disconnect comes from for me, which is I felt being talked down to for the majority of the game time.
That's interesting. Because to me, I feel like the game is about, obviously in broad brushes, it's about vengeance, right? But the second one, but I feel like from the last hour of The Last of Us all the way through The Last of Us Part 2, it's about a butterfly effect in which they were really close to solving the problem, and now everything is even more fucked, and they make you see it. And the reason I say this is it requires an interpretation of the story that I know isn't true. And what I mean by this is that I had this theory about The Last of Us, and I asked if Neil was on because I remember asking them this on some show I did with him.
Sure.
Before we became friends, I was like, is my interpretation of the ending of The Last of Us 1 properly? And I explained it like this. I said, the Fireflies had no guarantee that this was going to work. So I thought I was reading that in the documents, and
there's a tape recording of that, I think. Yeah.
Right. Joel kills the doctor. And Freezer, and now this is the obvious origin of this butterfly effect. But in my interpretation, I was like, it may not have worked anyway. But Neil says that that's not true, that it was going to work, that the intent was that they did have her and that it was going to work. Now, he said that before I even knew the second game existed. So that was something that he felt at the time. But not being able to let go of that, I kind of, because I think I write fiction, I write games. People can do whatever they want with what I say. I mean, I have, like, Twin Breaker is an anti-war game. No one interprets it like that at all. So, so they're free to interpret it however they want. But with my interpretation of the end of The Last of Us drawn into the second one, it's about how insane, if what he's saying is true, and that they really did have, they were this close to doing surgery, killing Ellie, getting a cure, then it really goes to show how completely heinous Joel's situation was, and that maybe Joel deserved to die. But that's why watching Joel die is hard. The end scene when Ellie has flashbacks of watching Joel die actually made me tear up. Like it made me like feeling it, because we love Joel and we love Ellie, but looking at the story itself, it's like, you guys really fucked up, and now maybe you're getting what you deserve. And I can't help but get away from that. Yes, I know people like to say, like, Neil, we get it. Everyone's good. Everyone's bad. This man had a family and this guy had a girlfriend. We totally understand all. I totally get it. But I don't want to also understate that I feel like maybe with Hallie Gross co-writing this game, as opposed to Neil basically writing the first one on his own, maybe changed the tenor and nature of the game in some way as well. But I still feel like the through line, if you interpret it the way Neil had intended the end to be interpreted, the first one, I think it makes The Last of Us 2 shine, because it's really about your comeuppance. Well, I don't know. To me, I find that compelling.
First of all, you're gonna have to change the name of this video to a postmortem review of Last of Us Part 2. But no, I tend to agree with you, Colin. And one of the things that comes up in my comments a lot is this conversation about kind of the utilitarianism of what Joel decided to do. And there is that recording that says, hey, these guys are crazy and they don't know what's going to happen. And if that is accurate, if Mr. Druckmann actually thinks that, I think it's a pretty massive mistake in terms of, I think there is a story to be told for, hey, okay, this ended the world effectively. And I think that's interesting. I tend to look at the end of Last of Us Part 1 in a way that's, I think, completely distinct from those comments in yours, which is, again, rule of law kind of guy. I say, well, okay, so society's over. This is Ellie's choice. Wake her up, tell her what's going to happen, and it's up to her. I'm a consent kind of guy there. Yeah. And I get fought on this and all kinds. So she's only, what is she, 16 at that point in time? It's like, she's killed people. She's an adult for all practical purposes of the world, especially the Last of Us Part 1. So the answer is not murder everyone. The answer is wake her up. Okay, Ellie, actually, it turns out you're going to have to die. What do you want from your life? And that's why I reject kind of what Joel does there completely separately. But you're right. If they had, instead of that recording, say, all we need is one more sample. We're right there. We're 99% done with the cure. We only need one more. This is going to save everyone. And Joel still does what he does. You can lead better into what Joel deserves. But then, in terms of a story, we're now following a character in Ellie that goes down the same path. And you're like, okay, all right, your message was that was bad. We're going to do it again. And you're going to finish off with that was bad. Okay.
So let's go down kind of that road. That was one of the areas that I wanted to get into was this question of whether Joel was good or bad. And it's funny because it was like a few minutes into this discussion, someone in the chat was already like, Joel was a villain.
I'm sure that you've already got a bunch of chats about Joel's various moral efficacies.
Yeah. Either he's a hero or he's a villain. And that was one of the things that sort of drove me to make my video on was Joel justified, was finishing The Last of Us Part 2 and seeing the fights over whether or not he deserved to die, whether or not he deserved to die in that fashion. And so for me, similar to Rick, I sort of wanted to put my lawyer brain on and like sort of see if I could lawyer my way into a question of whether or not he was good or bad or justified or not. And those are kind of two different questions, right? Good or bad versus justified or not justified. That's also, by the way, a question that I think some people are wrestling with Kyle Rittenhouse because of some of the other external sort of things that sort of came out outside of trial about him, that he had gotten into some fight, along with his sister and other things like that. But I guess we can sort of separate out, was he a good person or a bad person? I don't know. What do you guys think on that question specifically?
I mean, this might be very lawyerly of me, but I don't think we have enough information, right? Like, I don't think we know enough about Joel. And that's part of what I like. In the moment, he's the hero, right? He's saving this girl. He has this very daughterly, fatherly relationship that mimics the one we see in the beginning of the game. Naughty Dog's best kept secret when that game came out was the intro. And we get constant reminders of that world with Joel's broken watch and all of those kinds of things. But the reality is what I said earlier, is that there is 2 decades in which we have no idea what Joel did, except for we hear stories and ruminations of what happened. And it's clear that he's not a good guy, but it's also clear that the barrier, rather the spectrum of good and bad has shifted totally to another frame in this world. Good and bad doesn't even mean what good and bad means in our society. So it's hard to judge him based on that. That's justified true. Or not justified thing, though, he's clearly not justified in doing what he did. What he did was the selfish move. And that's what makes it so good, because he couldn't resist letting this girl that reminded him of his daughter go. That's what it is all about. And yes, it's a selfish move. And Ellie knows it at the end. Ellie knows Joel's lying at the end.
Although I actually came to an opposite conclusion at the end of my video. So I analyzed from the moment that he sort of wakes up, in the Fireflies compound at St. Mary's Hospital, and Ellie's already been taken away. She's still unconscious, but elsewhere in the hospital, and he finds out exactly what's going to be happening. sort of I went through each and every one of these encounters that he has where he's killing someone, he's killing his way through the hospital. Like, can I like now, granted, I gave myself a little bit of room because I was posing as his defense attorney, right? So I'm going to make the best possible argument as a defense attorney as I can in that circumstance. But I basically found all the way up until when he kills Marlene, I was able to find justification either on the basis of self-defense or defense of others because of that consent issue that Rick was talking about earlier. Because, you know, I went into the issues with informed consent, that in order to have any kind of now, of course, this is applying current laws, right? Into a hypothetical post-apocalyptic
Who knows what Fedra's
world.
laws were? Yeah.
Of course. But, you know, if we were to assume that today's laws existed, he absolutely would be justified for most of these killings because of the fact that they were performing a procedure on someone who had not given any kind of consent, let alone informed consent, and B, who also was underage, but they could have gotten that same sort of consent from someone else, either Joel, maybe Marlene, because she was sort of taking care of Ellie before she handed her off to Joel for their trek across the United States, or what was the United States. And so for me, I actually found that he was mostly justified, except for that last killing, because he had already put Ellie in the car. Everything was basically ready to go. He walks back over to her to talk to her, to say a few last remarks, and then ultimately shoots her when she's already on the ground. She's already injured. She's not going to be coming back after him at any point soon because he's on wheels. She's got a bullet in her abdomen already. But aside from that, I actually found him to be justified in most of those.
Well, it's a video game, right? So one of the problems we have is that you're limited to that interaction period. In the real world, faced with an angry Joel with a gun like that, I would have to believe there was a non-murderous way to make your way to Ellie if you needed to. That said, it's so attenuated that there's the one person in Ellie that's potentially going to die as part of this, that you're going to murder that many people. I have trouble seeing it as justified. I'm not saying your analysis is wrong. I'm saying that it's, if we put it in front of a jury, let's say, I don't think Joel's coming away from that one, regardless of how you frame it out.
Well, it might depend on your jurisdiction. Maybe in Texas.
I don't. It's one of those where I'm in entire agreement that it's a consent question. And I do disagree slightly, which, as I said, I think Ellie has all functional capacity as an adult in that world and what she's been through, and at that age for that situation. If you think about, like where you could give consent in the medieval times, you just got a different life in The Last of Us Part 1 world. So I think she could consent. And I do think that the Fireflies are wrong to not give her the chance. So you've got two wrongs butting up against each other. But I never for once thought that Joel did the right thing at the end. This is where you'll get more comments, and I get 100 comments in my video on The Last of Us Part 2. So it's one of those things again where it's like Last of Us Part 2 spends its time saying, "Oh yeah, Joel was wrong," and I'm like, well, okay, if you imagine me, Mr. Druckmann, as the person that already thought he was wrong, already thinks vengeance is a problem, disagrees with this notion, like, what did I do for 25 hours, right? There wasn't a story for Rick Hoeg, which is okay. I'm not the whole market for video games. If you love Last of Us Part 2, more power to you, including you, Colin. Well, less power to you.
I never get upset about other people's opinions on video games. It's like the least offensive thing in the world to me.
Absolutely. I give 12 minutes a 0. Some people,
unless they're my games.
I haven't rated your games. I refuse to do that. But I'm on Twitter giving a game a 0, and somebody puts in like the Simpsons gif of Homer going back into the hedge saying, the feels when you liked 12 minutes. I put in a tweet. I said, look, I would love to be in your shoes. I want to like everything that I play or try or watch. And I don't judge you at all. If you loved it, fan-freaking-tastic. I didn't. But, hey, that's what makes the world go around. Let's talk about it constructively, and that's fun. We could talk about things like Last of Us Part 2, and that's fun because I don't begrudge anybody that liked it. But I don't think Joel was justified. I think he was selfish. I think part of the greatness of The Last of Us Part 1 is you think they're building a kind of hero story, and what I would argue is they've built a kind of broken obsessiveness story about how he lost his daughter and the reminders and how he loses tests and what Ellie becomes and how he cannot give it up. If this were a kind of drug addiction story, it would look very similar, but instead it's a girl, it's Ellie. And I think that's fantastic. I think it's genius. I think part one is amazing, but because it's wrong at the end, it's not amazing because he's justified. It's amazing because he's not. That's why I like part one.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, Joel's weak at the shows weakness at the end. He knows what needs to be done, but I can't
and he
help
has
it.
a feeling Ellie would have consented to it, right? There's a reason the conversation about my life can't be for nothing happens immediately before that. He has a feeling that Ellie would say yes. And he also, like the Fireflies, doesn't want to hear her answer if they woke her up.
That's true.
Doesn't want to hear it.
Yeah,
that's what makes it doubly wrong.
That's a great point.
Which that's another interesting point about the consent piece, right? Is that, you know, if we were to in today's day and age, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, asking whether somebody would have consented if you had asked them, you know, if you were 100% certain that someone would have consented to a procedure and you didn't actually get informed consent, that no one cares about that in the law today, right?
Nope.
Like, no,
it's not going to do any good.
Absolutely not. But when it comes to a situation like this, now, of course, we're dealing with a post-apocalyptic world, post-judicial society. You know, it kind of makes you sort of look back on some of the more technical, strict restrictions, I guess, that we place on our society through things like laws and regulations and all that kind of stuff. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, well, to what extent do we actually need those things? Now, I'm not advocating that we should get rid of informed consent laws at all. But it kind of, this sort of a game sort of helps to sort of make you think about that kind of thing. Would you guys agree at all?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean,
at all, maybe.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Here's my thing about everything we're talking about. It's what I had said earlier. In my opinion, is that we don't know enough about the way the society works to even, like, for instance, one of the great things The Last of Us does, I think, especially the second one, the first one does, I mean, extraordinarily well for the time, is makes you feel every death. If you're strangling a dude and he's gurgling and reaching for your arm and you're beating him with a 2x4 and it's like really heinous stuff, which I think is all part of it as well. What I think the game is telling you over and over again is the barometer in this world is totally broken. And you wonder, and in my mind, I was playing around with these ideas of like, what does Fedra's courts look like? It actually reminded me a little bit of, I don't know if you guys watch or have read The Handmaid's Tale, but it reminds me a little bit of that, of Margaret Atwood and the Hulu show, in the sense that we only see a small portion of their country and it's orderly. But when you get little hints of the rest of the map, like when they show a map in the background and you realize that they don't have control of anything except for like their immediate area, you realize that there are probably different rules and expectations in different places. And you can imagine that Fedra is a fascist dictatorship with kangaroo courts and people are regularly getting away with whatever they want. And we also don't have the barometer to set by which the things that, like, I would argue that there's almost no doubt that the things Joel did in that 20-year period are way, 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 way worse than anything you see in this game. And not knowing that, because just the inclination, imagine being suggested, like, we saw how it all went down, right? Joel and his brother running away with the daughter in the van. People are dying left and right. This is immediately when it happened. Imagine surviving that for 20 years. And then what that might say about you, your expectations, the ability of you to get things done, and like what that means for consent, what that means for violence. I'm sorry.
A lot of it. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
No, I was going to say is, so I don't disagree, but I think the argument in terms of philosophy is a little bit misplaced, which is good and bad don't change in the apocalypse. It's just that good dies off. We're talking about who survives, right? And we're talking about various degrees of bad. And you can maybe justify a lesser degree of bad over a higher degree of bad in that apocalypse. But overall, what Colin's saying is correct. That's why we like apocalypse stories, is the breakdown and what it means. But ultimately, everybody, as compared to a modern society, is bad. Everybody is on that side. If they've survived the 20 years, if they've made their way through, then you're some degree of bad. So we're talking about a different spectrum, but I don't think we can suddenly make them, oh, he only killed 20 people. This person killed 400. This person's a slaver. Right. All these kinds of things. You're already past what I would call the Rubicon for things that aren't acceptable for human beings interacting with each other. They might be necessary to live, and certainly I understand survival as a human instinct and concept, and Joel and Tess, and I think you get a lot of this context from exactly how Tess describes what they've been doing for the last 20 years and how those opening scenes go to get absolutely. In order to have made it 20 years, these are bad dudes. And that's okay if living is your highest kind of function. I don't think I would survive an apocalypse. I'm not going to do these things. There's somebody's going to shoot me and take my can of
Oh my
beer.
God, I'd be dead in probably 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Although I'd like to think that I'd be like out there like it's Red Dawn, you know, the Chinese invade and I'm out there with my rifle and I'm fucking going ham. But no,
but you know,
they're gonna come arrest me and throw me in a gulag.
Yeah, exactly. No, I don't have any kind of misconceptions about this, right? I talk into a microphone. I do law. Okay, gonna have limited use cases in a zombie or cordyceps apocalypse. So I get that. But when we talk about good and evil, it doesn't functionally change because of your circumstance. It just becomes a little bit easier to excuse or justify, which maybe is the same to some people. It's not the same to me.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too, is sort of talking about how either the good people die off or people change in order to be able to survive. And that kind of goes to how standards of ethics can change either over time or even across societies. I mean, even today, I mean, I'm overseas, right? So I kind of get to live in a little bit of a different world on a fairly day-to-day basis, I would say. Sure. But you know, Mr. Bites was telling me about someone that he encountered that was talking about, for example, we were just talking about this today, the ethics of telling a family member that they have cancer, for example. In the United States, it seems like that would be absolutely unheard of to try to keep that from someone, you know, an elderly family member, that, hey, you have cancer and this is how long you have left to live. That seems like a total affront to us on our standards. But in some parts of the world, there are people that say, no, that's absolutely the right thing to do. You let them live the rest of their life peacefully. And so it's interesting how that can change from geographic area to geographic area, and then also over time. But to see that the spectrum may have shifted for ethical standards in that time also sort of throws any sort of legal analysis of these kinds of things to the wind. But then on the other hand, I guess you could, if I'm going to play devil's advocate on myself really quickly, you know, on the other hand, there's also certain standards of I guess humanity that we can say that probably either should or could maintain a certain consistency, maybe not on you know, to the certain degree of you know, rules on informed consent, but you know, maybe basics like don't kill another person unless they're attacking you first.
Yeah. Yeah, no, murder's number one, right? I mean, that's the one that's kind of the most functional that we can agree on. And yeah, there's justifications and circumstances. But the question in a post-apocalyptic society is essentially, well, okay, maybe we have to, because we don't have a functional judicial system or else otherwise, accept murder, but we don't have to think of it as right. And we can try to mitigate against that. I mean, one of the things that I have a problem with in The Last of Us Part 2 is this notion that everything is broken down except for these pockets, but the pockets don't even seem to be governing themselves properly. There isn't that conversation. I keep coming back to that with Ellie or with Tommy saying, don't do this. You know, this is going to be visited back upon us. This is exactly what happened before. There isn't even that one voice, and that voice could be drowned out in a story, but there isn't even that one sequence in that opening part of the story that says, yo, wait, what are we doing? Instead, it's always, yes, this is what's going to happen. They killed Joel. This is what's going to occur. And it does. And so when we're looking at this, I think what The Last of Us Part 2 in particular misses is that the functional society should exist even in some capacity that we might recognize, whether that is actual, we could call it vigilante justice, but gun justice in these various places or not. And we don't get that. We don't get any of that. We still get tribes 20 or I forget what the difference between Last of Us Part 1 and Last of Us Part 2 is in terms of extra years. Is it 7 more? Are we at about
something like
30
5
years?
or something like something. So everything I think takes place within 25 years or something like that.
Okay, yeah. So and different reasonable minds can differ, as I say on my channel, about what that should look like. But there are no voices at all talking about the value in neutral application of rules, the value of anything except kind of not even frontier justice, but just kind of frontier survival. And so I think that's what rings false to me a little bit is they want to tell you a vengeance is bad story. And so they set up all the dominoes necessary to do that without any of the potential obstacles that realistically should be there to have the conversation.
It's funny too, because, Hoeg, you're right in that there is a group in the second game that they don't exploit enough in the storytelling that could have given us some texture into how other people might have been dealing with things in a more or less peaceful way, which is the religious cult.
Yeah. They're just targets.
First of all, people might remember there's some of the first things we ever saw out of this game. You remember it was like them creeping through the woods and they're like torturing that guy and the Asian kids running away and all of that. And I was like, who the fuck are these guys? These guys are awesome. And I thought we were going to get into not only the legal frameworks and the moral frameworks, but indeed the religious framework of this apocalypse and how that all might go in as well. And to me, that was a MacGuffin. Like they completely dropped that as if it did not matter.
Yeah,
that was obnoxious to me. Really. Completely obnoxious to me. And one of the things I think held the game back. But it's funny because in that society, though, we only get a taste of it. In fact, we go into their like capital city and destroy it. Basically, we may have gotten a different tribal interpretation of how they order themselves, because we see at least 3 or 4 different groups in the 2 games that, to the point, order themselves in these tribes and don't seem to necessarily have beef with each other either. Like they really are surviving. The people are in, the football stadium. People are in Jackson, Wyoming. The Fireflies are in Boston, and so on and so forth. And it seems like they are all trying to be fair and do the right thing. But to the point of the spectrum I was saying earlier, the spectrum is, it's like 90 degrees different now. And
sure.
Everyone has kind of shed a lot of their humanity. I wish we got to just see or understand more, I think, to the point of you were saying about like lost dialogue. If we just got to the point more in our like, what happens when you do this and get caught? Why is Fedra just shooting these people and not bringing them to some sort of justice? Why are you so comfortable smuggling, right? Like there's all these crazy questions that have to be asked outside of these frameworks. We just don't know enough. And that's what's so frustrating about it to me, but also what's so fun and mystifying about it. And what makes you focus on the characters as opposed to anything else, which is something that I find The Walking Dead and others do to my consternation, where they focus so much on people that they don't talk about the world. I think they do a pretty nice job in this of doing both, but we just, I hope against hope that we get that texture.
I think Last of Us does a lot of good world building. I mean, I don't mean to be too critical of it, but I mean, I think the area that you identify is the right one. And it comes back to that kind of Abby notion, which is Abby, because she's a part of the folks in Seattle, needs somebody to fight if you're going to have whatever, her own 10 hours. So they've got this cult. They've got the Lev plotline kind of fleshes them out a little, but otherwise she needs people to kill. And there's so much of that kind of puppeteering in the second part to me that I look at and say, okay, so we needed people to kill. So, okay, the whistling's pretty cool, but we're mostly just killing people. And it was a little bit better for Ellie, although I still think they have problems there. And I think, as I mentioned when I reviewed it, I think the story would have been stronger if Abby and Ellie's plots were interacting in some way. Where Abby, I had expected, okay, we can do a second half of this because she's going to be doing something else that's pertinent to the overall story. And except for kind of thematically, and I get that their themes are important, but except for that theme adjacent kind of concept, Abby goes and screws around and does her own thing for 3 days. And then we come back to the movie theater. I mean, that's the feeling that I have from the pacing and the plot line of the story. It's fundamentally why I don't like it. Then I have all sorts of problems with California and Ellie's choices and things like that. But it's pacing at the end of the day. And I think that all kind of comes back to our societal discussion because we don't get the context. Oops. And I'm spilling drinks. I'll have to correct that in a second. We don't get the context. I wave my arms around too much of what that group actually is and what it is about. We just have people to kill. when we're Abby. And I'm going to mute for a second.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, no, I think that that would have been something that would have been really nice if they had explored more, because that's something that I sort of wanted to talk about, was the ways in which a post-apocalyptic society, if I can talk, a post-apocalyptic society also has I would say, a higher likelihood of going back to sort of the more basic rules for living, like 10 Commandments style old religion. And so it was interesting that they sort of introduced that element with the scars, and some of their more, I guess you could say, rigorous social rules that they sort of introduced more along gender lines. That was one of the things that a lot of people took issue with. Other people applauded, of course,
Right.
depending on who you talk to. But it's interesting to see that explored a little bit, but that is one thing that I wish that they had explored a bit more. And also interesting to see that after 20 years that they would have completely gotten rid of all other religions that had already been in existence, because there are some religions out there that have some power over guiding human behavior in a similar way to regular, or I guess, or more formal laws. But it's interesting that in their mind's eye, they all sort of disappeared. I don't know if that was just sort of a convenient thing that they didn't want to run into issues with these religious groups, or
Yeah,
or what?
I doubt it. I mean, people, it's funny because knowing Neil personally, everyone's like, Neil's woke. I'm like, Neil's not woke at all. You have no idea what you're talking about. But what frustrated me about the Lev storyline, specifically in relation to Abby, even though they're totally attached, is this is what happens when out of context things leak, by the way. And everyone's like, Abby's transgender. And it's like, no, she's not. And so it would have been funny and interesting to explore these things, because I think with Ellie's sexuality, we already had explored some interesting texture in some of these things that you think might either be really okay in tribal society, like just love who you want, do what you want, or in the exact opposite, in a controlled situation where you have a more fascistic approach, where that would be not cool at all. And I think that they had to kind of have this. It did come off as this commentary on religion, on modern religion, that they were going to, abuse this person and kind of kick them out. But if anything, the whole Lev situation was just too much. That would be my only complaint, if anything, was just like, we don't need this. Because I think you're right, Hoeg. Like, maybe that whole arc existed so that Ellie can kill someone. Now, that's like, go after people and be mad about a situation. But just that temptation of getting religiosity into the game was so tantalizing, and it's a huge factor of the game I'm writing now. I'm writing a very religious game right now, and it's going to be awesome because I really want to see what people think of it. And I give Neil a lot of credit, by the way, for touching these subjects, knowing that people are going to blow back on him both ways. If this was, by the way, you just take this and you put it 20 years ago, the thing people would have complained about is the God stuff, period, being involved. Now we're in a more woke era where the Christian right doesn't care about that anymore. Now you have people being displayed in sort of gender roles and all these kinds of things that were more controversial. And you can tell why they wanted to keep the game under wraps, and maybe to the point, Hoeg, why they DMCA'd up the wazoo, because they were so crestfallen by these things leaking out of context, which I knew, because I was reading some of this stuff and I'm like, this isn't true.
Right.
Like, and so anyway, I'm getting off the
no,
track.
I think that's fully right. And I think, I don't like the leaks. I did my video series now thinking that, it's great that this got leaked out and et cetera, et cetera. But certainly as a lawyer, that's how I got involved in talking about Last of Us Part 2 at all, was in whatever that was, April or May of last year, going, oh, you can't do this. Or 2 years ago. It's 2020, 2021 is all just one big blur. But I think I tend to like the Lev plotline a little bit more than you. It is on the nose. I mean, I think a lot of this story in Last of Us Part 2, that I think what bothers me is how much I like Last of Us Part 1. Like, everything we talked about at the top of this video is subtle and nuanced and arguable and all this great stuff. And a lot of the Last of Us Part 2 is vengeance, religion, how people treat gender norms, et cetera, in a way that I don't describe as political necessarily in any capacity, except that it is just very much this is X, this is Y, this is how we feel about this. And Abby, I think, just had people she needed to kill. They really wanted to do that very, very cool scene of the island on fire and her riding a horse in. But I don't think they ever got to the place where the world building was the same as it was in part 1. And that harms the story because it becomes a little bit more propagandizing, a little bit more simplistic. I think I described Last of Us Part 2 as feeling talked down to a lot. I think you can talk about Lev and the religiosity as being talked down to throughout that period. And that's what I got more out of the game. That's one of the reasons it didn't work for me. That said, I too would have liked to have seen more. I would have liked to have seen how that worked out. I would have liked to have seen how exactly their rule of law worked, right? We say law is destroyed in this post-apocalypse. That's true. And also not. Like, these groups are controlling their membership somehow. And I would love to be able to make those distinctions. And we don't get a lot of that in Jackson. We get some of that with the Fireflies. They're clearly like a militia and probably enforcing their rules similar to that. We get nothing at Fedra because Fedra is effectively useless and gone by the time that we know of.
Yeah, we don't even know. We're not even sure if Fedra is the remains of the original American government or a force that took over the American government.
Yeah,
like, there's a lot of
government.
There's a lot of good stuff there. We don't know. You know?
Because Rick Hoeg likes to read signage. So texture artists that are putting this up there, thank you very much.
Nice.
We know that they're acting like a government agency and
Sure.
being like the U.S. government and using seals and things. Because I go and I get to the very start of Boston and I'm reading the signs so much so that I know that they used half of the signs from Pittsburgh, where I got very confused as to what city I was in.
Oh, interesting. Do you remember that they also used like a copyrighted Boston T map, like the T,
the
subway system, and they got in trouble and they had to like patch it out? Yeah.
Oh no, I don't remember that one.
I wrote about that at IGN.
With like Ubisoft and using Uncharted art and Assassin's Creed and
it's good stuff. Yeah,
or the opposite.
Yeah, it was. That was awesome.
Yeah. No, I mean, that stuff is always interesting, and you always have that because, you know, a lot of that stuff is outsourced. But I always do find that funny when I start Last of Us Part 1, which, again, one of my favorite games. Go look for it. There's the highway signs are talking about the Pittsburgh arena. There's a bunch of Pittsburgh little signs. And again, this is the guy that can't play the Division 2 too long because I wind up reading all of the museum plaques that are all kind of written out for the most part.
That's the beauty of the game, though, dude. That's the beauty of gaming.
I like
whatever you want it to be.
Last of Us Part 1 is great because I'm the guy that always is walking and not running around and doing those things. So it's a great world to walk around in. But yeah, Last of Us Part 2, a lot of great stuff. World building, society wise, I don't think it's as strong or as easy to talk about for that role as Last of Us Part 1.
So I think if we were to sort of tie it to, I guess, today's society.
Sure.
And we don't have to get too political, but you know, to what extent?
That, but you know,
I'm fishing for it. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, to what extent do you think that you could foresee our society sort of falling into these kinds of rotating doors of factions and various tribes and whatnot? Like, how long do you think that would take based on what we know about current society?
I think we're already seeing the balkanization of the United States. So in some way, and I don't think it's like happening like through war. I just think it'll ultimately happen as people just go to more like-minded places and lines are more divided. I don't think anyone, I don't know how any person can look at the United States and be like, this is going to last the way this is for the next 50 years or whatever. I don't think that that's going to happen without some change. And I think a lot of that has to do with just different people having different ideas and different ideas of self-determination. I think the power structures right now have lent themselves towards a left-wing power in the United States that, and I think in much of the Western world, that controls most of the levers of power. And so you can imagine that whatever comical or cartoon-like child that ideology might have is exactly what you would get in a tough situation. You can say that the thing about the other side as well, but factionalism is, I feel like we already experience factionalism. I just think it's generally peaceful, and the country's big enough to accommodate all sorts of different people thinking and doing all sorts of different things, which I think is part of the beauty of the Republic. But I could see, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I could see a reality in our lifetimes where the United States somehow peacefully splits apart into some sort of federation where it's like there are 4 or 5 components: common military, common money, like all those things. I don't think that that's out of out of the realm of possibility.
Colin, I mean, you're describing what the Constitution actually says the United States is, right? I mean, like it was supposed to be a federal government that's otherwise governing 50 United States. And those states had their own ways of doing things. In fact, there's a Supreme Court case right now today talking about whether those states should have more power under very controversial circumstances, and we'll see how it goes. But one of the issues in terms of power and balkanization, I think is the word that you used, is taking that kind of disparate concept of a people that can have reasonable minds that differ, but just good-hearted people that disagree on the way forward for X, Y, or Z thing, being forced into solution one versus solution two. And so, I think what we've got 100 years of expansion of the federal government's power over the states, not really at all helped by the current situation over the last 2 years. And that tends to exacerbate things because now at least a portion of your population feels put upon by people out in Maryland telling them how to live their lives, right? And so I think you might have an adjustment towards going back to a slightly weaker, certainly executive branch, a weaker federal government, more state control of certain important questions. I think that you can survive as what you described as a federation, literally United States, if you allow for those kind of differences amongst ways to actually govern a populace. If they don't do that, if the United States continues to kind of push down on the executive power and federal government power button, I think you really do risk significant fracture. But in terms of, like The Last of Us and video games, I think tribes, power sources, ways of operating would happen much faster than is posited by the game. You'll have people seizing power. You'll have functional republics, federations, tribes, frontier towns, whatever, happening to a much greater degree, much quicker than is posited if there were a collapse of all municipal, state, and federal governments at once, give or take. I think you'd see localization, municipalities really flourish, some of which would be not places you'd want to live. But I do think that would happen to a significantly higher degree than really either The Walking Dead or The Last of Us posits. But it's a hypothetical, right? We're peering into the multiverse on this question. But I do think the human reality is that there will be people that govern and people that are okay being governed, and it would happen pretty quickly, especially as we've seen, especially in the last 2 years, if safety is offered. And so I think that would happen pretty quick.
It's funny because you're right that is what we literally have. I think I'm pointing more towards like the anti-federalist view, like almost the Articles of Confederation view, although not far enough. Obviously, that's why the Constitution was written to begin with. But this idea that I think we're on board with each other for much of what we want to do together. I think that we realize, for instance, we want to have a common currency. There's nothing wrong with that. Having common defense, nothing wrong with that. But I lived in California, for instance, for 13 years. It's a completely different world than where I live now.
Well, especially the Bay Area.
Right.
I'm from Southern California, and I view the Bay Area as completely different from SoCal.
Right. Right. And people would argue. I mean, I was there. There was like this. Wasn't there like some sort of somewhat seriously considered thing to split the state up into like 5 parts, and they were going to vote on it? And
there have been movements to break it into, I think, 3 different states.
Yeah, like Jefferson was one of the states, I think. And so, but I look at it more of like, okay, I lived in San Francisco for 10 years. I lived in LA for 3 years. Those are 2 different worlds. I live in Virginia now. I grew up on Long Island. I went to school in Boston. These are totally different places. I think that we all can kind of relate to each other in many different ways. But I think maybe the thing that would bring comfort and ultimate stability to our society, maybe over the next 100 years, would be to just relegate much more power back to the states. To make their own decisions, and that might come with states binding together, into their own new pact. And this is the whole thing. I mean, even Lincoln dealt with this in the 1860s, was like the legality and right to secede and all of these kinds of things. A lot of interesting questions to be asked, but I do think that an interesting show that gives insight into how it could all go down is a seldom discussed, although beloved show for me, CBS's Jericho. Which was only on for 2 seasons, and that shows the end of the United States. And after 23 nuclear bombs go off around the country, and what happens after that. And it's cool because it's exactly like you say. There's a town that like protects a salt mine. There's a town that has wind turbine factories. There's a sex trade. there are these like so not that you want all these good or bad things. It just is what it is.
Right.
I think that's an
No.
interesting, if anyone's interested in that, that's a really cool look into how maybe things would survive. If you like Skeet Ulrich, he's also the main character.
I was just going to mention Skeet. Yeah, no. Jericho, by the way, one of the first really modern kind of fan campaigns to restore the show. It got canceled after season 1. So a lot of fun articles about that. But
yeah, nuts for Jericho.
Pop culture. I love this stuff.
Mm.
But no, Jericho's a good one. And you do have certain different takes on apocalypses. Frankly, we have too many. Honestly, when Last of Us Part 1 was announced, I was like, okay, zombie apocalypse game, sure. And then they knocked it out of the park. But yeah, I think it's one of those pieces of conversation that you can actually probably say people are so interested in that might be a symptom in and of itself of where we stand in terms of factionalism, that we're kind of thought experimenting as to what a breakup might look like is itself a data point, right?
No doubt, dude. No, by the way, that's it's so funny you say that, Hoeg, because I was just saying to my girlfriend Micah like a few days ago, 5 or 10 years ago, no one was talking about this. But this is stuff you see in like Politico, you know, like now it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it's frustrating to somebody like me, right? Like I'm a very big proponent of battling ideas, of having the conversation, of having rational discourse, and generally starting from a place where you believe in the other side's good faith, that you say, okay, actually there's a space where somebody could have a completely different view of the world, that thinks a completely different solution is the way to have a better life. And we can disagree, and they're not evil. They're not not human. They're not, somebody that we have to cancel or whatever other words you want to use. And frankly, probably 30% of the reason that I have my channel and I like doing it is to hopefully start having conversations and continue to have conversations that are basically on those grounds. And I use pop culture because for the most part, outside of the console war, where I got a lot of interesting comments, people can talk about those things without kind of dragging in some of the emotionality that is so kind of prevalent about politics and these kinds of things. So I want to have those conversations. And yeah, we can talk about how to read a statute and how ambiguity is a problem and gives too much power to the person that writes the contract or the law or whatever, in a context that doesn't involve your thoughts on Joe Biden or Donald Trump or anyone else. Like, that's the idea. It's one of the ideas behind virtual legality. And I like to think I'm doing good out there. And yet I occasionally get comments and emails and things like that, which are, give you pause. Like I want to be a good voice out there. I want to be someone that isn't creating more demagogues or creating more problems with those kinds of things. And yet, I do get the occasional direct message. It's like, well, how can you possibly talk to those people? How can you be on that stream? How can you do this? And it's like, well, let's talk again.
I've gotten that too.
I wasn't mentioning
more
anybody,
recently,
Colin.
Since the Kyle Rittenhouse trial.
I think I've been canceled by a forum for talking to you, Colin. That's
Reset Era.
That's different.
Yeah.
What? I didn't say any name.
My name's banned there too. But when I break the news, I'm going to break this week on the show. I'm going to see if I'm going to go there first to see if they can resist making a thread about it.
That's the thing, right? I keep getting pinged because they keep putting my videos up because they're pertinent, and there's no politics in them when I read through a terms and conditions. But
they're the worst. But here's the thing: is that I feel like, and by the way, bravo and kudos for doing stuff with about Kyle Rittenhouse, regardless of. What people
I got
think.
some messages about that, undoubtedly. Absolutely. It sounds like you did too, Legal Bites.
And good for you. Like everyone deserves a defense, and analyzing a good defense, by the way. In fact, the best defense. You want the system to be able to, to be able to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt. Even I know that. And I only studied American history.
Adversarial system.
So to me, I look at our system and I'm like, it functions pretty well. I just think, like with Rittenhouse and with the Aubrey murder, I was like, to me, that was both righteous justice. Although the Aubrey thing I thought was horrible, how they had to leak that video to even get, them charged down in Georgia. But the point is that I think even then with divisive politics, like the Rittenhouse jurors knew what was going on and knew what was riding on their verdict and what might happen. And it's scary. Reminds me a little bit of OJ and actually watching that recent documentary, that 5-part documentary from a few years ago, where some of the jurors basically admit like he wasn't guilty. We knew he wasn't, or like we knew he was guilty. We nullified. So there are different functions that I think would work well in any corner of the country that I think a lot of people agree upon. I think what we've let happen in our society, unfortunately, is demagoguery, and also just a lot of what you had said earlier. You always say, Hoeg, like agree to disagree, like just complete hostility towards other people. And if you're going to reduce people to racists and bigots and all these kinds of things, then obviously they're not going to want to work with you or be with you or be around you. And this is just a self-fulfilling prophecy. It ignores all of the commonality between people. You want a good education for your children. You want to live in a secure neighborhood. You want to, like, everyone wants that. But the second you start lobbing these Molotovs at people, it hardens them. And I feel like we are in a lot of people make reference to like the 1840s and 1850s. And I'm like, this is not like that at all. But
a few things have changed since then.
A few things, specifically, there's no slavery anymore.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to have my own profession, for example.
Right. And yeah, you'd be also many years from voting. And so unless you lived in New Jersey, which always allowed women to vote. But I feel like we have to find a way to remove these people from positions of power that are, I think, convincing lots of folks that this can't work the way it is working right now. And it's certainly convinced me in some way that things can change. You know what I want is that, what is it, that 25th Amendment gathering of the, no, it's not the 25th Amendment. No, what is the gathering of the, or article, it's article something, the gathering of the states where they can rewrite the Constitution.
A constitutional convention.
Constitutional convention, right.
Now, honestly, Colin, you think that would go better for us if the states got together right now and redid our Constitution?
No. I don't want anyone to redo it, but they don't have to. It's not binding. I think they're only 3 or 4 votes away from doing it, as far as I understand. And,
from having a constitutional convention?
Having a convention, yeah. Like certain state legislatures have already voted to do these kinds, to send a delegation or whatever. I think you have to have 36 or 37 states, and they've.
I think it's 2/3, but I mean, I'd have to look into that.
And I think it's similar to the push for the popular vote nullification, where a bunch of states have already signed on to that too, and they're just waiting.
There's an open question about whether that's a violation of the one person, one vote constitutional rules. So I mean, the state legislature giving away your vote is problematic. It would be tested.
Look into it. People are running on this article, or Article 5 gathering of the states thing. And
I will look into it. Yeah.
No, and I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I don't mean to cut you off. I would caution anybody that thinks that a redo of the Constitution in 2021 would be more favorable for the freedom of contract or liberty or whatever's important to you. In all honesty, we're in an odd space in state governments, I would say. But it is interesting if there are people pursuing that angle. It is a very difficult thing, specifically, deliberately, to amend the Constitution, to have a constitutional convention, because there is usefulness in solidity, even if that goes in a direction that isn't great. So I understand the desire to say, well, we've gotten way off track. I'm on record as saying the executive branch, that includes both of the most recent presidents, if you're interested, has claimed way too much power, and Congress sits on its hands, and we got a big problem with the way the 3 branches work right now.
Which, I mean, that's gone. That's also true of previous administrations too. I mean, we can go back so many administrations on the expansion of executive powers.
I always try to make clear it's both of the last 2, just to try to help people understand that this isn't a Biden thing. It's not a Trump thing. It's the executive branch signs pieces of paper, does things like emergency OSHA regulations. We're way far away from what the Constitution envisions. But I believe a constitutional convention would arrive with something more like a positive rights constitution that looks more European than American. And I would question whether or not that would help the disconnect in our country right now.
I want to say real quick, I put a link in our private chat, you can see, but the Federalist Society says that there are 27 state legislatures have valid applications outstanding for a convention to propose a balanced budget amendment, and at least 6 states with applications have outstanding applications for plenary conventions. So there are states that are working to get everyone together on 2 different counts, one for amending and one for full rewriting of the Constitution. I will say that I don't want the Constitution to be rewritten. I think it would be really good for us to all get together and talk about it and say, don't you think? Like, I would love to
Our
have all the
deliberative
states.
bodies are supposed
That would
to
be
be
an
doing
interesting
that. Yes.
conversation for sure.
Yeah, like we don't. It's like the committees of correspondence and the first and second Continental Congresses, especially the first Continental Congress, which was unofficial. Like you can, it would be good to just say like, let's have each state vote in a one-time election to send specific people to a place to talk about the Constitution under Article 5. Article 5 doesn't say you have to rewrite it. It's that they're rather there's a voting mechanism to come and discuss changes to it. I think that would be a huge first step. We haven't had anything like that in society since, you used to have things like the Hartford Convention and stuff when people were like planning on seceding from the Union and stuff. But you never had anything where people were trying to, talk about the document itself. You know what I mean? And the only thing we really have is to work on, as you guys know, I'm a huge fan of the Federalist Papers, but we almost need like, I know that Supreme Court cases are basically this, but we almost need like a new baseline that we all trust and believe that allows us to interpret this increasingly living document. And I think just getting people together to talk about it would be very constructive. I would love something like that. I don't know what would come of it. And the change, as you know, it's almost impossible to change the Constitution. So you're not going to get 3/4 of the states to do anything. So it would really just be an exercise in academics to see, what can we learn about each other?
Yeah.
What can we learn when we all get together? And it's not the Senate and it's not the House. It's other people, not those morons, but electing. Maybe there's in Pennsylvania, for instance, maybe there's a great state legislator people really like, and they send him. And in Minnesota, there's a lawyer of great renown, and they send him, and whatever, just a thought, maybe something a little fanciful, but I would like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just reading through that document. So they're positing an aggregation of Congresses not specifically asking for an amendment convention. It would. So the first thing that would happen if that tried to be called is that it would be challenged up to wazoo. You'd have a Supreme Court decision that would be very, very interesting because the Supreme Court is a mess right now. So it would be interesting. I'm not against the thought experiment. I'm a lawyer that likes to talk and think about these things. It would be wild. It would certainly be good video fodder.
Oh my God, yeah, you guys would do great.
Oh yeah, we'd be covering the crap out of that. But
we would all blow up to past 100K.
Oh yeah, there you go. But in terms of whether it would solve the problem of factionalism or improve the United States for one of the other political sides, I think it would be just as likely to end in real fracture than it would be to kind of make things better, make them whole.
Yeah, it's true. But that's a good point. But if that's the end result, would we rather know now?
Strip the Band-Aid off. The philosophy if this is actually already happening, let's.
I feel like we're talking about a marriage.
Yeah, well, but isn't it kind of isn't it though? Like in some way, like people, we never. You guys know more about this than I do for sure, but it's the idea of even consenting into the society. Like I think I think it's been generations since people have really stopped and asked themselves, like, what the hell is even going on here? Like, what are we doing? Why are things the way they are? And how can we make them better? And how can we make them things worse? And I agree with you, Rick. I'm so conservative, not politically, I'm politically conservative, but I'm so conservative about things that I would never want to. It's like bringing a weapon to a fight.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Like it's like you don't bring a weapon to a fight; they'll take the weapon away from you and kill you with it. It's like so. I'd rather just go with my fist and hope for the best. But at the same time, I think I just want to know if people stand in a similar way. I think that reducing ourselves in that 9th and 10th Amendment kind of way to like a bunch of states where everything is done or supposed to be, burdened by local and state governments, and having a little more autonomy on that level, I think might really appeal to people and might make people in California realize like we can live our lives the way we want to live our lives in Northern California and Southern California.
Yeah.
And we can live our lives in Ohio, and we can do all these things. And we have so much in common. Let's bring the pot down to a simmer instead of a boil.
Absolutely.
It could go in that direction too. Yeah.
I would argue on that score that the right answer is a Supreme Court that actually reads the 9th and 10th Amendments as existing. I mean, like that's what needs to happen as kind of a functional level, is they were read out of the Constitution essentially because the Supreme Court found them difficult and didn't quite give them enough power over what they wanted power over. And so a lot of this, and people get mad at me. I say very few political things on my channel, but one that you could argue is political that I say, I think, I don't know, every couple of episodes is how much I dislike John Roberts. And this notion of kicking the can down and
Which there are
avoiding
people on
tough
both
questions.
sides of the political spectrum that don't like him. Let's be real.
Well, I don't.
For various reasons, right?
It's not about his decisions one way or the other. It's about the lack of legal understanding, the lack of justification, and the desire to avoid making tough decisions as a freaking chief Supreme Court justice. And that creates a lot of tumult. A lot of the fracture, a lot of the friction between people could be alleviated, even if the law went the opposite way, even if it went a different direction. If there was certainty, if there wasn't this notion that the Supreme Court is effectively looking back and saying, well, what have we done? Which one will hurt us the least? And what can we do to just say, oh, standing. You don't have standing. We're not going to answer that question. See you in 7 more years. Or this is moot because the side that was in trouble here is just going to solve it the day before they actually have to argue before us. Because there's nothing Chief Justice Roberts likes more than saying, hey, I don't have to answer that. Fantastic. But it creates problems because we don't have certainty in so many areas of the law. Half of my channel exists to talk about the lack of certainty that we have. And that's, you read the Federalist Papers, there's entire sections about how one of the functions of the Constitution and the laws that are promulgated thereunder is to give people the notion of where the lines are, to give folks an understanding of where justice, which is a function of human beings writing words on paper, lives for that purpose. And we realistically don't have it right now in so many important areas of our lives. That's, in my opinion, where you get a lot of these fights. You get a lot of these arguments is because who knows what CJ Roberts is going to decide the next day. And that's how we live.
I was going to say, isn't the scuttlebutt on him also that he's incredibly politically aware?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that he is. Insofar as when you see the decisions come down, they're triangulated, to use Bill Clinton's old term, to try to say things that kind of meet people in the middle, but don't necessarily follow the law. There's an instance in the last year where he had dissented to a case. It came back around because the composition of the court had changed. He would have been the 5-4 vote against it. He instead wrote with what would have been the minority was the majority because he joined it saying, yeah, I know I dissented to this exact same concept, but stare decisis from last year, even though I think he put a sentence in that says, I think this is unconstitutional, I'm going to hold it up. It's like, that's bullshit, man. And that's about as harsh language you'll hear me say.
Yeah. I'm startled.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, and that's not good for the long term, right? Like because when you're a law student and you're taking constitutional law, you're going back to the very beginning and seeing how these cases develop and how certain cases become either sometimes canon or sometimes anti-canon. And usually the ones that are anti-canon tend to be the ones that where the reasoning just isn't quite there. Like they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole because it's kind of the more convenient thing. It's they're sort of trying to reach a certain end in particular. And so but over time that ends up becoming untenable and you have certain issues that really come up in terms of application to everyone's everyday lives. And these cases, that the reasons why they're going up to the Supreme Court is because they're important to people, right? There are people that are actually affected by these laws. So I definitely agree that is a big frustration about that kind of reasoning. And it's overall just problematic when things are triangulated for political reasons. So
I hope you're watching this, Roberts.
Yeah, he is.
He's 100%
right
watching this. So anyway, I think that probably about does it for me. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Unless there's anything else that you guys want to talk about.
I'm good. I mean, I'm really happy to be here. I appreciate you inviting me. I really, I thank you for that. And it's always good to talk about the intersection of games and anything. So, especially,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's what we use Hoeg for on our show is to kind of get into provide more texture and more, I'm using that word a lot today, I don't know why, and more, I guess, more cohesive and cogent arguments for things that are otherwise easy to attack, like the Activision stuff that's going on right now. Instead of just taking the low bait of obviously ridiculing them, we instead have someone like Hoeg who has an education to come in and give us a little bit of insight into what's actually happening. So it's been cool to interface with this world. It was really cool to watch you guys and your guys' success on various channels, not only here but elsewhere,
Thank you.
covering Rittenhouse. And I really want to reiterate, I think it's awesome that there are people in all silos, all entertainment silos, wresting control of the narrative and everything else from the big guns. People would much rather watch this than MSNBC. People would much rather watch Last Stand than IGN, more and more and more and more. And it's awesome. And it happens in the trenches like this. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I think just before we kind of head out, there's just a handful of super chats here. If you guys are okay with that,
Why not?
We'll go through them because I think there are a couple questions for you guys too. So the first one is Don Lionheart says, just a tip of the hat for bringing on some wonderful and knowledgeable people. Looking forward to watching in full when I have time. Mr. K says, Colin, I see you've rejoined the Taliban. Is that because they're back in power? Jesus,
yeah, I got my
bandwagoner.
Taliban. I got my whole Taliban beard going on. I'm an Italian man, American man. This is how it grows in. Then I just shave it off and then it comes all back. I can't do anything else. So right now I might look a little more intimidating than I might in a few weeks.
Awesome. Real Radic
Real
says,
Radic.
he says, how did you feel about Left Behind, Hoeg? By the way, Colin Druckmann was on the Left Behind postmortem you did at IGN.
Okay, cool. Left Behind, of course, is the DLC. That takes place. It's actually a prequel, I think, to The Last of Us.
Yes. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, it's where Ellie gets the bite, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I thought it was fine. I'm not as enamored with kind of Naughty Dog's bigger DLCs. I'm not as enamored with the one from Uncharted 4 that I can never remember the name of. I'm not as enamored with Left Behind. But I thought it was fine. They're good storytellers, usually. And they're very good at making game worlds. And their artists are out of this world. Might be the best in the industry. So I thought it was okay.
Nice.
Wow.
Mr. K says, Alita, please stop asking for pics of my feet. I am not, so please don't send me any. By the way,
how do you put up with this ongoing line of questioning?
I don't know. It's just become a meme because of Arcaded Stream. I don't know how it started, but it just kind of became this thing. People want to see my feet for God knows what reason why.
Stop it.
God. The internet's so weird.
It's
it's so wonderful, but it's so weird.
It is. I mean, I just take everything as a joke, so it's fine.
Good.
And
I think
he
that's
says
the right way to handle it.
Yeah, I think so. And Mr. K also says, by the way, Hoeg, don't underestimate your lethality. I'd enlist you in my medieval army any day as our flute guy.
Okay,
Nice.
all right. I can learn that probably.
Yeah.
Super Iron Bob says, to beat my personal dead horse, repeal the 17th or otherwise give back the states themselves some representation in the federal government.
I totally agree. I have no idea what that was all about. Like that is so strange that, and now that they want to get rid of the filibuster, what they basically want to just have is two of the same body. Like that.
Yes.
It's very weird. Like we might as well just have a unicameral legislator.
Well, and it creates a lot of problems with discussions, right? You get a lot of these, whatever side you're on, articles about how, these two senators only represent X amount of people and these amount of people want it. It's like, no, that's not what the Senate is, Hoss. They represent 26 states and 2 states. I mean, that's what it's about. But you do have these conversations now that are either uneducated or decided that they're going in a different philosophical direction about things like the Electoral College and what the Senate is realistically supposed to be. Because you get a lot of conversation points on social media and elsewhere that says that that's fundamentally unfair when it was designed to be a representative democracy of states, a federation, a combination, a coalition, and not just a big old body of people. Because California, you don't want to be ruled by Michigan or Ohio or Iowa. And neither do they want to be ruled by you.
Right, exactly. And I mean, you guys know more than anything. I don't have to say. It's just that the Senate is, I feel like the 17th Amendment came around the time when there was just a lot of activist government changing in the United States. And it's the same thing with prohibition, and then there are obviously good things like the women's right to vote is in there too. But I think it has, I think a lot of things were just happening. Like there was a lot of activism post-war, Civil War. And I think this is one of those things that just doesn't make any sense. And I don't know why people don't realize that it doesn't make any sense. You already vote for a representative. You know, I don't know why you'd need to vote for another one. I like the idea of getting rid of the 17th Amendment. I think it's, I'm sure you guys know, I mean, it's not going to happen, but it's the most compelling amendment change. I think that can be done right now.
I think it's solid. And the problem is you'd have to find a time to do it where the state legislatures were pretty evenly held, if not exactly evenly held, because it's never gonna pass without it.
That's fair. That's fair. Shroom Dukem says, sincerely loving this conversation while I'm wage slaving at work. You and Hoeg have been very insightful. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Andy the Game Maker, that's my brother, by the way. Hey. He says, quote, in quotes, how can you talk to these people? Stems from Charles Sheldon's In His Steps. He was a socialist that coined WWJD and used that to suppress ideas. So interesting. Thanks, brother. Rakin Khan says, tell Colin that he's why PSN is an appeal to heaven.
Oh, okay, cool. No, Revolutionary War reference. I think he's saying my PSN an appeal to heaven. It's not. My PSN name is Moriarty-IGN, but appeal to heaven is like one of my favorite Revolutionary War flags, and I'd like to fly it outside my house, but I feel like no one would understand it. So.
I had a video idea. We're gonna do a video. Is Colin Moriarty's PSN name a trademark violation?
Yeah,
it's gonna be great.
That was always my fear with that. Before I think I told you that story, right? About I made my when I was on IGN, I made my PSN name Moriarty-IGN, and you couldn't change your name. So when I quit, I was afraid. I was like, oh shit, I'm stuck with this name, and I still have it to this day because I'm just too lazy to change it now. But at least I know I can.
Give you one now? Do they give you one change now? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it's one for $10 or something like that. It was similar to like the old Xbox 360.
No, I don't know that I ever got your actual name. I think you did reference the fact that you had wanted to change it and you couldn't. But it is
Moriarty-IGN is my name because in the old IGN days, it's not like that anymore. Everyone was something -IGN. Like that was what it was. That was when you knew you made it. It was exciting, you know,
badge of honor.
But not so exciting when I quit 7 years ago.
I could get that.
So, all right. Well, that I think about does it. This has been absolutely wonderful. I would love to have both of you guys back. Maybe when Cyberpunk 2077 finally comes out with its upgrade, and Mr. Bytes finally decides that it's ready for him to sit down and play it.
That's how I
can
feel
bring
too.
You guys back to talk about Cyberpunk, right?
Yeah, that would be awesome because I'm doing the same thing. I'm waiting until the PS5 port is out, and then I'll get into it. I don't want to pay very much money for it because I don't want to reward them. I
forced my way through it, so I have my thoughts.
I've heard good things about it. I mean, I've heard good things, but I don't know. I'm certainly not on PlayStation,
I honestly
so I'm not
think
going
it's a reverse sliding scale. Like, so Witcher 3 is either my first or second favorite game of all time.
Wow.
Right? Cyberpunk 2077 as a game. Let's pretend it didn't have any bugs and it was just perfectly running. It doesn't hold a candle to Witcher 3. So what I think you get instead is this kind of you get these cycles in media and social media, right? Which is like everybody says it's crap. It gets pulled from the PlayStation Network, everything else. And then people find it 3 months later or whatever. Hey, said he's pretty cool. Why are people so mean about it? And so I do think there's an overall swell of, it's not that bad. And it's not that bad, but it isn't Witcher 3. And that's what makes me sad.
Yeah. Well, you'll get more Witcher, I think.
Nice. All right. Well, somebody in the chat says that I need to use a gavel to end the stream with. So here's a gavel right here.
Nice.
Hold a gavel out? All right.
What's that? It's actually funny enough. It's not even mine. I think it's Mr. Bytes from his like Model United Nations days from college.
Oh, all right. So I have one last anecdote. Right. So Battlestar Galactica was one of my favorite shows when it was on Sci-Fi, the redo. Right. And they had an auction for the props from the show. And pretty famously, Galactica had a lot of legal kind of circumstances. And they had a gavel. It's just like a rock kind of thing that they smashed down to do tribunals. And it was part of the mutiny plot line, all this good stuff. And I'm a young lawyer at the time. And I'm like, all right, we got maybe a little cash. Let's go try to buy this thing. I was outbid by a factor of, I think 10 in trying to get that. But I can give this story to you now, so it's all worth it.
God, you're such a nerd. I love Battlestar Galactica, so there's nothing wrong with that.
I am in fact a nerd. I own it with pride.
Me too.
I actually have not seen it, but I've heard so many good things. What I do love, however, is the episode of Portlandia where they get obsessed with Battlestar Galactica to the point that they completely destroy their lives and hunt down what's his name, the writer for it.
Ron Moore.
Yes,
Yeah.
Ronald D. Moore, who I met once. He's a very nice guy.
Nice.
Yeah. And anyway, so they try to hunt him down, but it's an entirely different Ronald D. Moore
Sure.
in the Portland area, of course. I mean, it's a hilarious episode.
That's awesome.
But
By the way, Ronald D. Moore was behind the canceled Santa Monica game from Sony that never came out. That was his game.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Love,
Oh,
see, I
interesting.
love it.
Mhm.
All right.
Alrighty.
Mike,
All right, now
On
we
that
can go.
note,
I'm done.
on that note, we will see you guys in the next video. All right. And now the awkward